I just have a few things to say about this incredible essay. Really just prefatory. I know Conrad also would like to make some opening remarks just to sort of set a tone for conversation. But at any moment, I just want to remind folks to, raise the hand to jump in. It's not an interruption, it's a free flowing exchange. Alain Badiou has a nice essay in response to On the Materialist Dialectic, where he points out a kind of contradiction um, in the sense that it is so much influenced by Mao Zedong. But you'll notice that, unlike Mao or French Maoism, the category of the masses, like the masses in revolt, are not. What substitutes for that is what Althusser calls social practices, right? And so he's trying to kind of move away from, in a certain way, this I don't know, like Maoist emphasis on the rightness of the rebellion of the masses as outside and head of the party and things like that. So it's a curious treatment of Mao. The other thing is that the subtitle is, of course, on the unevenness of origins. Um, and the thing to note here that Althusser mentions in his self-criticism many years later is that he didn't realize it when he was writing this text in the early 60s, that this was fully from the standpoint of like the ontology of Spinoza and a kind of monism. So he's talking about a revisitation of the contradiction and determination essay on the one hand, as well as a revisitation of his essay on the young Marx, where he's taken on Feuerbach, and he's trying to schematize, right, this kind of tripartite movement of the Hegelian dialectic, right? Um, which we can get into in a moment. I tried to do like a PowerPoint of the three generalities, but I'm not too pleased with it. And unlike Gabriel Tupanamba, another comrade from Brazil, I'm not good at the like Sam McCormick is, whatever, the digital chalkboard. I don't know why I have a phobia of digital chalkboards. It's just not in my it's not my deal. But we can sort of envision the three levels because I think this is the heart, at least of the first part of the essay, that we must master. Um, this movement, precisely because the distinction revolves around this idea of the given of empiricism or the givenness of pure sense, and the way that the givenness of the question is sort of how is knowledge generated distinctly for Marxism, and ultimately what this comes down to is a sort of dialectical procedure whereby knowledge has to penetrate into what Althusser calls a theoretical practice. But when it penetrates into a theoretical practice, which of course is an analysis in a Leninist vein of the situation, right, of the conjuncture, um, it gets tripped up with ideology. It gets tripped up with ideology. And both Feuerbach and Hegel miss level two. In other words, they both succumb to a kind of perfunctory unity between one and three, right? And all of that then has a very interesting discussion that Althusser elicits regarding the inadequacy of Hegel's theory of the totality. And one of the things that we have to note here is that he, which is kind of strange if you think about it, in this time that he's giving these lectures on Montesquieu, and so a lot of critics have shown that he's sort of reading Spinozistic monism onto Hegel's conception of totality as this fully self-enclosed interior system, right? And in some sense, for Hegel, there is a defunct totality, or totality cannot think rupture, cannot think something new. And I would just say, as a side point on this notion of rupture, event, structure, I would contend that this essay in the history of sort of like French Marxism, especially for Alain Badiou and others, is really driving at that, right? Which is what this essay is really about is a sort of post-Leninist philosophical analysis regarding how the Marxist intellectual is to ascertain the current situation, right? Which kind of goes to Kolya's point about how Althusser has to be read in a big sweep of Marxist thought as a commentator on Gramsci, or as a natural heir, let's say, of the Gramscian moment, right? And so ultimately, what is at flaw in contemporary Marxist sort of forms of thinking the conjuncture are either a kind of idealism of humanism, which he finds expressions of within the French Communist Party, within Stalinism, but he also finds a sort of similar problem in what he calls mechanistic materialism. So he wants to avoid both traps, right? The concept of unevenness is doing quite a lot of work in this essay. It's important, I think, to look at Mao's own practice and contradiction essay to sort of get a full picture regarding this notion of unevenness. And I want to say a few things very sort of precisely and even read from the text, because I think that that very much warrants our attention, this notion of unevenness, because what unevenness is about for Althusser is really the notion of overdetermination itself, okay? And in a certain way, what we're dealing with here, and here I'm referencing the latter section of the essay. Pardon me for jumping around a little bit, but I'm just trying to give you like sort of some key points from the essay. He starts off by saying that, well, in the Maoist conception of primary and secondary contradictions, it's not to be understood as a sort of two-tier level whereby like there's sort of a difference in the terms of the essence of the two contradictions, but rather that because the capitalist system is one that functions on total domination across the board, the secondary contradiction is always this sort of internal element of the primary contradiction of the system itself, right? And that the principal contradiction is not to be understood as somehow quantitatively larger than the secondary contradiction. And this is owed to a theory of domination, which I felt is an interesting side point, given that everybody in Marxist studies today is looking at the theory of Marxism and what we call non-domination, right? Which, Bruno Leopold has his new book out on Marxist republicanism. And here we have Althusser coming up with a theory of the inescapability of domination within social life and capitalism, and the way that this creates these overlapping contradictions. And he says that every contradiction is a complex structure of the whole, right? And that the way that you sort of can delineate distinctions between contradictions is by identifying what he calls the conditions of existence, of social existence, and that it's that precise identification of the conditions of existence that Hegelian thought is incapable of doing. Why? Because in Althusser's reading, Hegelian thought will always privilege the idea over the existing conditions. And so if you go back to that three-part level of generalities, it's that second level of theoretical practice that the Hegelian movement of thinking rupture or thinking contradiction or thinking the present moment will inevitably just sort of become recycled back into the currency of common ideology. Right? So overdetermination has to do with a reflection on the conditions of existence, of the contradiction within itself, and of the situation in such a way that the philosopher, right, the Marxist philosopher, does not fall sway to a pure empirical analysis of those conditions of existence, right? And that is where, and I'd love Conrad's thoughts on this. Althusser pivots between ideology and science, right? And he doesn't write too much about that distinction, but I mean, he invokes it as the notion of epistemological break. He makes a reference to Bachelard, and I felt like that was a part of the essay that I wanted more from this distinction between ideology and science, right? Because uh, he says that theory is any theoretical practice of a scientific character, right? So theory is like this active investigation into the existing situation, its conditions of existence, in order to derive something that would be different than existing ideology, right? Um, yes, and I think that overdetermination, he says, designates that the reflection in a given contradiction itself um, is always a reflection of the what he calls the situation in dominance of the complex whole, which means that the contradiction is not univocal because it reflects to itself the unevenness of the complex whole. That's the sort of point. So there is like this becomes the means by which Althusser wants to think a revolutionary rupture from the totality of thinking of the capitalist system, you could say, right? Um, so, I mean, again, this essay is sort of a continuation. It's quite long, it's quite dense. There's quite a lot here. Philosophically, there's much for us to chew on, especially with this notion of the given, and even I know that some folks study Wilfrid Sellars and the myth of the given. Althusser is invoking this notion of the pre-given. Um, so there's quite a lot here. There's also, and I'll stop here, a very interesting point that he makes at the end of the essay, where he basically says, look, everything I'm saying is not to be understood as some profound revision of the materialist dialectic as Marx and Engels develop it, even, and this is why, what does he end the essay with? A quote from the Anti-Düring, where he's trying to show that his reflections are fully compatible in some sense with thinking, because one of the risks here of this sort of anti-Hegelian or this sort of scission of Hegel that he's proposing, one of the risks, it seems to me, um, is that all of the concepts of Hegel, right, from Aufhebung to the negation of the negation to the unity of opposites, well, notice Althusser is not necessarily abandoning all of those. He's not necessarily abandoning all of those. But I think what he's saying is that um, uh, he's following almost like a kind of trajectory that builds off of Lenin and Mao. And it would even be more interesting, and I've shared an essay on this as well, to further penetrate into the precise political moment that Althusser is facing in the early 60s. I hinted at some of the points, the humanist controversy, um, the Sino-Soviet split, I think, had already taken place. So there's some of these moments that could be thought in this way. But I mean, all in all, I find the essay transitional. I don't find it conclusive. I find it highly abstract and highly transitional, but extremely thought-provoking. Conrad, would you like to say a few remarks?
Sure. Um, so thank you, Daniel. And I just want to add, by way of Menashe, it's Mao's essay on contradiction. He said on contradiction in practice, I think is the Verso volume with
Oh,
the
my
Zizek.
bad.
Yeah, yeah. But a pretty innocent mistake. I don't think that's gonna misdirect us anyway.
It could get me
Um,
canceled. You never know.
well, and you might be becoming too sensitive if you think that's gonna get you canceled. I think that, a lot of things going on.
Yeah.
But no, with respect to this essay, um, I think in a way, Daniel. maybe being generous when he describes it as transitional. Because I'm going to venture a bolder hypothesis, which is that this essay is essentially a failure. Um, and, you know, it's not, I'm not saying it's bad. We're not movie critics here. We're not here to tell you if you should go or not go to the film. The reality is it's an essay by Althusser in the 60s. It's bound to be better than most things, I think, by virtue of that. Academics are also compelled to obtain positions, which means that a lot of what is produced is not great, an inevitable consequence of that. Um, so, but I think the basic problem, and by the way, I found it very interesting when you were talking about monism, because we know that there's a footnote here where Althusser actually contests, in a sense, the application of the term monism to his work. Um, and he says, my critics, and he brings up Roger Garrity, who is the kind of patron saint of the idea of a reconciliation between um, communism and Catholicism in France in the 1960s, and thus very attached to the kind of humanist hypothesis. And I think Garrity later became a spokesperson for Islam, I believe, and I think somehow attached to the events in Iran or something. I'd have to read it,
No,
but I think
that's exactly right. Yeah.
yeah, I think he was derided for anti-Semitism as well in the French press as
Which is
well.
very tragic because his turn to anti-Semitism retroactively canceled what, within his Marxist period, was like some very, good theoretical work.
Yeah, yeah, but not to digress too much. That I find it interesting because the one thing in terms of the way he uses Mao, way he uses on contradiction, is it does get toward this more Spinozistic conception in terms of the relationship between substance and modes and so on. Because he clarifies that, it would be a condition of the scientificity of Marxism, um, that, if you can have this unevenness, it's because these things are anchored within determination in the last instance, right? Which in turn has to do with the structure and dominance, right? The idea that there's this sort of the economic education as we know it, for example, is anchored in the essential structure of capitalism, right? But it's interesting, like, to think about how this might relate to Mao's actual writing, because like it's important to understand that like when Mao wrote on contradiction in the 1930s, China was not really capitalist, right? So of course we could talk about, China's place within a world defined by capitalism and the sense in which that might validate Althusser's hypothesis. Um, but it's not so clear that there would be, on a national level, a single element you could anchor the analysis within that way. So in a way, I feel like it's interesting in his note because he talks about how his critics often use the word pluralism to discredit him, right? Monism is often sort of cast as pluralism, and he dismisses this. He says it's essentially ideological. But I feel like that oscillation, right, between monism and pluralism is somewhat evident in the shift from Mao to Althusser. Because in Mao, it's more of a pluralism, because he's talking about this economy in which, in a way, it's just like chaos, right? Like there isn't, that was exactly the problem, right? You had decades of civil war, right? There was no centrality to the economy, right? I mean, and if there was, you could say, well, it's like, in a way, it would be a kind of peasant tributary production, right? But this itself was being besieged and destabilized from all sides, right? By European colonialism, right? And then by Japanese invasion, right? And the Japanese were industrializing the Northeast, right? So in a way, like pluralism is more relevant for Mao, but the idea of anchoring the pluralistic analysis in a kind of monistic, um, um, anchoring of determination in the last instance, I think would be much more relevant, you could understand, to an economy like France in the 1960s, which was thoroughly capitalist, albeit, of course, as we know, with a high level of redistribution. So I just wanted to add that. But I know you're not here for that. You want to hear why I think the essay is a failure. So I will get to the future presentation. Um, what I think happens in this essay It's interesting with respect to the placement of it within the text, because I think that in many ways, by the time we get to this essay, the core drama of For Marx has already happened. I think really the climax of the book is contradiction over determination. And I think contradiction over determination, one of the really powerfully enduring contributions of Althusser to the Marxist tradition, because I think it really represents quite a brilliant attempt to formalize methodologically, the events of the Russian or Chinese Revolution in terms of how that might question the way we have to think about dialectics, right? And one can, you know, um, it's probably inaccurate to simply contrast that with Hegel. In fact, it's almost surely inaccurate in the way that Althusser does it. But it nevertheless does serve as a rebuke to a kind of teleological reductive conception of Marxism, which was, in the culture at the time he wrote. So when we get to this essay, what he's really trying to do is he's trying to close the loop, right? And every philosophy book does this at some point, right? It attempts to project a kind of completion, right? And here he's doing this by treating these kind of epistemological problems, right? And he points out, I think quite accurately, that very often within the Marxist tradition, there has been practice, there's been powerful interventions, but methodological problems have not been dealt with adequately. He does acknowledge, attempts that were made in this direction. So he references Marx's 1857 Introduction to the Critique of Political Economy, which plays a role, of course, in influencing his remarks here, and would be very important for anyone trying to think critically about the theme of Marxism and epistemology. You'll notice that word comes up a few times here, epistemology, right? He also references Lenin's philosophical notebooks, right? Which is sort of the closest that Lenin ever comes to being a real philosopher in a way, even though the fact they are notebooks. And that's not, to discredit Lenin. He was many things, right? He was an incisive political thinker, strategist, very insightful comments on economy, distilled from Hilferding, and so on. But, Lenin's work would not have been exactly philosophical in the sense that um, very often what Lenin is calling for is the need to take a position, yes, that is precisely strategic and political, which also is why Althusser stresses the essentially conjunctural nature of his work, in this. Um, and in a way, you can say that with Althusser, right, with the focus on rupture, right, and the rejection of this kind of holism of method, the Althusser, in a way, is trying to construct a philosophy, right, based on the conjunctural rupture that Lenin posits, right, which is not thoroughly philosophical. But again, if one were trying to get into the philosophical thought of Lenin, the notebooks would be the right place to look. But here's the issue, as I see it. Um, I think the basic problem here, if we're looking at this text, is that there is a contradiction in the text in the way that he conceives of epistemology. So, and I think it will be no secret to anyone familiar with my work at all, which you probably aren't, but in case you might be, that I'll be influenced by kind of the context or discourse of real abstraction in what I say, which I'll elaborate on a little bit more in a minute. But I think that on one hand, when he talks about the generalities, right, which is maybe the closest thing we find to a kind of core thesis in this text, and it is a distillation from the 1857 Introduction to the Critique of Political Economy. He introduces generality too, right, is bridging between the raw material that theory works upon and the concepts that it generates, right? Um, and when he introduces it, he maintains its completely the intellectual status, right? It passes within thought, he tells us, right? But then later, of course, when he's discussing the difference between, um, the simple contradiction of Hegel and the complex contradiction of Marx, again, drawing on the 1857 introduction, he discusses the way that, uh, with Marxism, you could never begin with a simple contradiction because everything you do is already conditioned by the complex structured whole, right? That's going to feed into, right, the simple contradiction itself. Now, the issue with this, right, is that he does not actually produce a transmission mechanism, right, in his epistemological analysis between the complex structured whole, right, and an interpretation of the mediation between generalities 1 and 3 that is entirely intellectual in character, right? In other words, he cannot produce a conception of the form of thought, right, that sufficiently acknowledges its determination by the complex structured whole. And what we get in that context, right, is a kind of, in France, they have this expression, you could be like, du dimanche, right? It means sort of bad, right? Like, you could say that, you're like a peintre du dimanche, right? The guys who paint the pictures for the tourists in Montmartre, right? Instead, what we get is a kind of Kantianism du dimanche, right? Sunday Kantianism, right? Or a sort of poor man's Kantianism, if you will. And actually, this is something that Gillian Rose accuses Althusser of, right? A kind of unacknowledged Neokantianism in the analysis, in the way that he approaches this, right? But then this chafes against something I think which is much provocative and richer, right? Which is again the precise determination of thought by the complex structured whole and how that happens, right? Now I know Roberto Finelli has written about this subject. Great book, by the way. Um, his book on parasite. I'm not sure the exact title. His book on parasite that was published by the HM book series of Brill. The first volume is out now. There's another volume that I may help out with a little bit. But he discusses this, but he discusses the way that, um, how beginning in Hegel, the determination of abstraction by material context is already pursued and endeavored upon, and how within Marx's work this is deepened and made more rigorous, also with respect to larger changes taking place in society. Again, so he's at the interstices of that, trying to investigate uh, the nature of this link. This is not done here, and you'll find that if you look at, there's a line of criticism that extends outward from this. And by the way, this basic failure that I'm describing, right, to produce the link between the complex structured whole, right, and the determination of generality too, if you will. I'm not persuaded that's would be the most effective way to present this in a different context, but um, the failure to produce that link, it's also very connected with Althusser's theoreticism, right? Now, I want to be clear, like if we're going to criticize Althusser's theoreticism, I think Althusser is very correct to acknowledge the importance of theory, right? And, I think in this respect, he stands on the tradition, right? Of course, there's a sort of, um, you know, populist cliche, whereby like you can win any Marxist discussion by just being like, practice. We need practice, right? Like you're Alan Iverson in a media scrum. Um, but the reality is that if you look at Kautsky, right, the merger formula, right, what does Kautsky say? Right? Kautsky says that socialism was not produced by workers, right? Like workers, they were spontaneous, right? So, what workers wanted was higher. The natural thing to ask for was higher wages, right? But socialism came from outside, right? From utopian socialism, right? But utopian socialism was too abstract, right? It didn't have a movement, right? And so what Marx really represented was the introduction of these ideas which had previously been bourgeois ideas, and the making real of them by way of an actual movement, right? And of course, this is reworked by Lenin in What Is to Be Done in order to justify, the vanguardism that he was pursuing at that time, right? Which again, I think it would be incredibly idiotic to characterize as like just anti-democratic or something. This is very complex, right? This whole issue. Um, but there was a critique there, right, of the impotency of the kind of mass organizations that have been built up by the German party, right, at that point. But again, I think Althusser is correct to emphasize the importance of theory. But the issue here again is like, if you're, and of course we have practice being praised here at different points and the importance of practice. And performatively that's correct. But if you're going to emphasize the importance of practice, again, you have to, and if you're trying to produce a methodology, right, very important, um, you have to somehow explicate the link, right, between thought and practice. Now, this is not an easy thing. I recognize it's a very high bar to impose for any Marxist philosopher. If I'm judging the text to be a failure by virtue of its incapacity to produce that, in a sense, this is flattering to Althusser because it speaks to, the respect one might hold him in as an intellectual. But again, this is the problem. So he ends up in that respect, much like a lot of the people he's criticizing, where he's capable of acknowledging, the decisiveness of practice, right, or the formulation of theory in relation to practice, as the case may be, which is acknowledged in the text. But he is markedly less able to produce a solution himself. Now, in terms of a lineage of critique extending outward from this. Um, my thesis, Marxism contra subjectivity, a lot of it deals with the idea of real abstraction. Real abstraction refers to the idea that the form of thought itself, or what we take to be epistemology, is conditioned by economic processes, right? So the idea that, if you think of Kant's transcendental methodology, that in a sense, this is a projection of the value form, right, at the stage of its ubiquity within capitalism, right? Or that dualism, for example, could be traced back to the division between use value and exchange value, latent in the generalization of the law of value, for example, right? And this term is usually associated originally with Alfred Sohn-Rethel, right? Whose 1970 book, Intellectual and Manual Labor, was very important for this field of study. And I think today, probably Alberto Toscano is the best known exponent of this kind of thinking. But if you actually look at the framing of real abstraction, and again, real abstraction is really about trying to explore, to particularly look at the category of economic form, right? Rather than brute matter, right? And rather than ideas, right? To understand that the way that they might be linked through the notion of economic form, right? Of course, Marx says that not an atom of matter at some point enters into, the value of the commodity, right? So value becomes, for example, something which can be put on neither side, right? It can't be put on the side of generality 1 or of generality 3. And then in that sense, it becomes an optimal candidate, right, for explaining the link between them, which is not explained here by Althusser. But if you look at that actual lineage, even in Sohn-Rethel in 1970s Intellectual and Manual Labor, he relates this problem to Althusser, right, who's a palpable influence upon him, right? So he says that Althusser, he quotes from Reading Capital actually, he says that Althusser says that, the development of science or whatever, if you will, that it passes entirely in thought, right? And he says that with this very statement, Althusser defeats the purpose of his inquiry, right? Because he fails to appreciate, right, the determination of thought by precisely non-intellectual processes, right? And this, in a sense, is the starting point, right? We see a similar thing later with Slavoj Žižek in 1989's The Sublime Object of Ideology, right? Where Zizek, and he links it to Lacan. You'll be shocked to hear. But Zizek talks about this, and he says that in a way, what we would need is to understand the determination of the symbolic by material processes. And then he discusses real abstraction as just such a way of materializing the symbolic, in a sense, right? And that's actually a very important and iconic passage from Zizek.
Yeah, the footnote to Sunratel made me read Intellectual Manual Labor from Sublime Object for sure.
Yeah, I think many people, and actually that's one of the things in Toscano's iconic essay, The Open Secret of Real Abstraction, that he discusses the Zizek reading as well. So I think many people, I don't know about him, but I think many people got there
Hmm.
through that.
I mean, I think can I say something about this neo-Kantian um, accusation?
Sure.
Yeah, this is for discussion. I mean, look, I feel like it's a bit unfair, maybe, to say that because, in classical form, like neo-Kantianism um, is a bit more um, presenting a kind of epistemology that is conceiving of reality as fundamentally dualist, and it tacitly affirms the noumenon, the unknowability of the thing in itself. And so if you're saying that methodologically Althusser cannot think the passage of generality 2 because he has an insufficient theory, because remember at one point, and this kind of connects him to Lukács's history and class consciousness to some extent, he says within generality 2, we think the dialectic of the in itself and the for itself. And so, yeah, you're sort of brought back to the problem of the merger thesis, which is kind of like going back to Alia and Kolia's point as well. And the so I guess what I'm wondering is that label of neo-Kantianism accurate? Or is it sort of just like a kind of effect of the failure of this essay? Like it's kind of like a slur. Anytime someone is insufficient in terms of a dialectical grasp of the totality of the system, they get this accusation of neo-Kantianism. Now, we should note that one of the very nice elaborations of the practical problem, aside from the philosophical abstractions of the issue, going back to like the Marburg School and so on, is neo-Kantianism is an expression of the class position of petty bourgeoisie, right? That's an old Second International claim, right? Um, so, what actually is the neo-Kantian accusation? Maybe we could start there.
So I'll just wrap up and respond to that. Um, and it's a great point. Of course, Daniel and I did discuss this on the phone a little bit earlier. So, this is a bit like WWE. It's all a little bit staged in advance. So don't
That's
don't
not
believe it.
true. That's not true at all.
Don't believe it.
He's
Uh,
lying. He's lying.
but no, yeah, that's why they brought me in, right? I'm the heel. But no, you're close to the Mason-Dixon line, right? You know what I'm talking about, Daniel. But no, but seriously, uh, with this, I think that so first of all, like yes, it's a slur. I quoted Gillian Rose, so if it's in Gillian Rose, there's a good chance ratio-wise it might be a slur. Because she does like slurring people a fair bit. This is part of the beauty of reading her work. But some of the most, you know dense and difficult to read slurring you'll ever see. Um, but no, I mean, I think that, the essentiality, again, it'd be more complex than this, particularly insofar as, because like Charles was talking about this, particularly insofar as we're talking about the attempt to renew and reinvigorate certain elements of pre-critical philosophy as well, precisely by way of like a pretty sophisticated critique of the epistemological method, right? So again, like there are different things going on there. But I'm saying that this is kind of what I feel about why that slur about neo-Kantianism comes up, because like the thing is like it's so reflexive and essential to how we conceive of philosophy in the most essential sense in our society that whenever anything like breaks down, that's kind of what pours in. So I don't want to color the whole system
Well,
with that.
the problem with it from a Marxist point of view is that it's fundamentally anti-revolutionary. Like Engels says, it falls back on a faith of agnosticism. So it would be a betrayal to Althusser's entire like impetus with the essay, which is to allow Marxist theoreticians to think revolution, right?
Right.
In a
But you
concrete
understand,
situation.
right,
Neokantians cannot do that.
right, but this is the problem, right? Because if you intellectualize entirely generality two, right, then you're not producing the proper link between class struggle, right, and like the production of concepts, right? You haven't resolved it at the level of form, right? And this is precisely what reinforces, for example, the charge of theoreticism as well, right? Like when you're not able to capture that. And then there are other parts of the essay that suggest like a more fruitful appropriation of reality, right, than that. But the point is like at its weakest link, to use a kind of Althusserian, that's what we get. Now that doesn't mean that the whole essay is Neokantianism. It doesn't mean that Althusser is, as Rose might say, a Neokantian. I think that would be going much too far. But all I want to add before closing up, all I want to say, or not closing up, but closing up my remarks anyway. But all I want to add is that I think that it's interesting because as if in a recognition of the limitations of this particular essay, this is probably the point of Althusser's work that is subsequently revised the most, right? So of course we know within a few years he'll say, well, um, you know, uh, what you have 1966, I think he says, being is decisive over thought, right? Which doesn't represent a formal revision, but already is throwing into doubt, right? Some of the things he says in this essay, or perhaps assigning a greater weight to some and a lesser weight to others. But then beginning in, I think, 1967, we have a shift where the role of philosophy is reconceived. So we no longer have the theory of theoretical practice, right? That is theory in its moment of self-awareness, right? What we have, which he attributes Marxism as being uniquely capable to accomplish, but does talk about potential links to other sciences. But what we have is we have, again, this philosophy as being a way of taking a position within the class struggle, right? And then this is linked to this idea of like, this kind of Leninist or Engelsian conception of these sort of transhistorical materialist and idealist currents, right? And how philosophy positions itself with respect to them. So that's another dimension of that. And eventually what that's going to do, and actually, who was the one who recommended the book by Peter Thomas? The Gramscian Moment. Who's the one that recommended that book?
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
Was it Kolya? Was it Kolya? Okay. Yeah, so I read through that in the past because I was kind of intrigued by the description. It's a big book. It's a good book. Not a perfect book, but a very good book. Not many books are perfect books, as the case turns out. But I feel like Trump talking this way. But anyway, it's a good book. It's very big, but not perfect, but very good. It's a great book, but one of the best books recently. But um, no, in that book, one of the things he points out, and I think Thomas kind of sees it favorably, but in Althusser's um, progressive devaluation of the role of philosophy, he ends up coming closer to Gramsci in kind of casting philosophy as a tool of class struggle, at times even a spectator to class struggle, and the apotheosis of this would sort of be his late works on aleatory materialism, right? And there's a lot of people who reject that, because the golden age, right, of Althusserianism is so bound up with an emphasis on the significance of theory. I personally think that emphasis on the significance of theory is powerful and important. I think also with respect to the Marxist tradition, we might use a Leninist idiom and say that it's bending the stick in the other direction, that it serves as a useful strategic corrective as well. But that is not to say that, he lands the plane on the strip perfectly. So I think For Marx is a great book. It's a wonderful book. But I think here we are seeing some of the methodological tangles, right, that are going to lead to extensive and sustained attempts to self-revise, and kind of produce a more self-coherent system. So that's what I have to say.
Okay, great. Extremely helpful. You sort of let us down, but then brought us back up, sort of like delegitimized the essay, but then like sort of re-dignified it somehow at the same time. So kudos on that, Andrew. And I just want to invite everyone to jump in. I know that sometimes people talk at sort of like a high level of theoretical sophistication, but don't like this is also a group that is meant for all different all different levels and so on. So if there's also like because it's a super dense essay and it was a struggle to read, but in a good way. Andrew, how did you find the essay?
Oh, I thought it was very complex. I liked the way it was written, but I think like there were a lot of things that were I was scratching my head. And well, first of all, it's interesting to see how Conrad is very meming today. And I think he should meme more. The Allen Iverson and the Trump thing were hilarious. But no, so I had the hunch to go back to page 62 and 63 from the four marks in the young Marx section, and I had asked the question in that last session that we had on the young Marx when he brings up the break between the analytico-teleological method to a more Marxist orientation on understanding ideology, and he gives us three principles. And isn't it interesting in this materialist dialectic how he gives us three generalities? My and I think Conrad answered a lot of sort of speculations I had, especially on kind of deprivileging like the text, but also raising it up in a higher level in certain ways, and just kind of thinking about like, okay, this is Althusser in the early '60s. He's still building up his thought. My speculation on this, and maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, or Conrad can, but it's like interesting how like in the first principle of on page 62/63 that ideology must be regarded as a real whole, right? And that you can't alter any of the parts without messing the totality. And why I bring this up in juxtaposition between the three generalities is because, well, we're dealing with ideology in that instance, and for him, it seems that he's comparing ideology with philosophy. And I was talking with this talking about this distinction with Colin Bodale, and he's like, yeah, there's this sort of interesting distinction between philosophy and science in Althusser, but it seems like for him, science, no matter what, even if it's sort of a conflation to bring Hegel into that ideological sphere, that ideology always remains internal and can never escape that internal circulation. Whereas for science, it's always outside and there's always a break. That philosophy, no matter what the idea or the concept is, it never reaches a radical break. And so, for a Marxist practice or a Marxist theoretical understanding of what a praxis might be or a practice might be, its scientificity comes from the fact that it is outside and that it's always breaking from that ideology and internality with something of the three generalities, right? And it seems like we could jump off those three principles of understanding ideology from page 62 to 63 from generality one, that science or something that is a science like Marxism is dealing not with givens or raw material as such in an empiricist way, but something that is in a social field and a social practice that is dealing with a complexity of ideological concepts, etc. So that was like the way I was kind of piggybacking off of that or playing on that. I don't know if that makes sense. And it's interesting how he gives that footnote that like there could be a whole essay on generality too, that we
Mm,
can't go into depth on that, but it's very interesting to think of like if you play off the three ideological principles versus the three generalities.
hmm. Yeah, because in the early Marx essay, it's about the concept of the problematic, and so you would have to then sort of superimpose um, the way that Feuerbach and Hegel remain insufficiently um, caught within ideology, caught within a false totality, caught within a conception of the totality in which all of the concepts that make the dialectic work ultimately don't produce a rupture, don't give you science, etc.
Right. And I guess like it's like how does the generalities keep us from even falling into a scientific nominalism? And I think that's the whole thing about the class struggle, right? You know, that and I don't know if it's universality, but something of emancipatory politics or something of a science that could account for that. That doesn't lead to just a generality that leads to nominalist facts. Like that was my sort of speculation too. Like how do we keep from falling into generality to nominalism? Or keep our generalities from falling into nominalism?
Yeah, I think it's, and I think like there's sort of a shot game you can play here where whenever Althusser says like we put this question off for further research, like you can take a shot. Like he does it all the time. Right? He comes up with some like really tantalizing thing and then he's like, but yeah, no, I mean I think it really I think you've really nailed like the core problem, which has to do with nominalism in that sense. And again, like I'm trying to sorry, at the beginning you said what you were saying the problem was, can you just repeat what you said at the beginning for me?
Yeah, at the beginning, I was like, because when I was reading this essay, I had a hunch to go back to the Young Marx essay in the
Yeah.
text and re-jot out the three principles of ideology and how he was saying that, as a Marxist materialist, we should break from the ideological, or what do you say, analytical teleological method. And so, like, as a Marxist science that would account for ideology, we have these three principles that
Yeah.
are ideological,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so, like, what is the first one? He says that an ideology is a real whole. And so, if you mess with any of you can't alter the whole. You can't alter the parts without altering the whole, pretty much. And it seems like philosophy, for him, not saying for me, but like from my reading, that seems like for him, philosophy does so much to, even if it tries to alter the parts, like maintain the whole, right? And therefore, it can never have a true break, right?
Yeah, so this is what makes part of this essay so frustrating, right? And like what it really is like a lot of the beauty to me of what Althusser is doing is it's like it's anti-epistemological,
Hmm.
right? In the sense that epistemology is an attempt to produce this kind of holism, right? And it's like, and yet he feels compelled in this essay to return,
Hmm.
right? And, like a good philosopher, to kind of come up with an epistemological method. And the difference with something like real abstraction is real abstraction is not epistemology, it's a critique of epistemology, right? This essay is epistemology, right? Because real abstraction is rooting epistemology in material factors, right? Like real abstraction can't be defended on a purely epistemological terrain, right? Because then you just say, oh, well, you haven't justified the material indices you're relating it to, and then you're back in the epistemological problem. But this is part of the thing that Althusser is getting at. So science, right, and the way he valorizes it, it has precisely to do with its like non-holistic character, like it produces breaks, right? But then we have a problem, which is that if you're going to use an epistemological method, which is intellectualist, to explain science, like where the fuck does science come from? Like, just drop out of the sky? Like it's
There's
like,
Right, and
oh,
I
it's
was
another.
just
thinking
There
of
is another.
Galileo in the sense of decentering them, but it's like, if there's a Galilean science, right? Does Marxism fit in that extension of Galilean science, or what? And I say that because I'm a Lacanian, and I follow Lorenzo Chiesa, and psychoanalysis fits in that Galilean science of decentering,
yeah.
sorts of humanism and ideological centeredness. But it's like, does Marxism fit in that, or what? And I know he mentions Galileo in this essay as well. So, and then we also read Bertolt Brecht, and so my
Yeah, and
Gal.
that's super interesting. That's super interesting because in Sonreitel's book, he claims that dynamic inertia, like as a theory, comes from the movement of commodities in the market because like they never stop, right? And he's like, but this is the thing because Koiri points this out. Like, there's no like inertia is never happens in real life. Like, who comes up with this theory, right? Oh yeah, it just moves, right, forever, right, unless it's stopped. It's like that's just a weak, crazy thing to think about, right? So then there's the question of like, what is the social context that produces that? I don't know. And maybe it's a bit far-fetched to say like, well, that's commodities in the market. Maybe that's, you know, adventurous, but it is a theory, and we don't
I
have a
think one
theory,
of
right?
the problems that has emerged in all like the Althusserian school that we haven't looked at and that I like people to think about is the notion that of epistemological novelty, of conjuring, of the intellectual conjuring a new problematic. of their analysis of the given situation. So what that then leads to is kind of theoretical saturation or adventurism, in which the problem becomes very, very, very close to the problem that Marxists faced in the Second International, which was Marxism becomes permitted through Althusser's strict kind of like invitation to develop so much theoretical newness. Yeah. Well, like take Ernesto Laclau, right? Ernesto Laclau like abandons exploitation as a category. He abandons a theory of the centrality of mode of production. Like he makes Marxism obsolete in its core, and then so to defend Marxism against the Althusserians, and this goes to E.P. Thompson's criticism, one then is made to appear as a kind of old fuddy-duddy, which is very condescending, right? So you see, he's developed a sophisticated way to develop all of this new thinking, actually. So Conrad's saying that the essay is a failure. Would you say it's a failure from that point of view? In terms of, and here I'm channeling Isabel Garo's criticism of Althusserianism as an ism, right? You catch my drift, right?
Mhm.
Isn't it true, though, that maybe one of the problems, and I don't see how this is a Neokantian problem. I think this is, to your point earlier, theoreticist, or sort of like maybe too much power granted to the intellectual to declare certain breaks from Marxism as construed as a tradition. So does that make sense? Like, does that, because I'm just trying to account for that fact. And even with Badiou, I mean, I'm sorry, but like, yeah, but Badiou also has this insane reinvention of Marxist categories. So perhaps I wonder if folks think that that's a danger, or if maybe people don't think that's a danger. Marxism needs to be injected with all of this, like thinking breaks and new problematics, and we're caught in an old problematic. And what do people think? Because obviously, it's no surprise that the central category that is most contested at this time is, of course, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so the fact that Althusserians are at the forefront of theoretically transcending it and putting it to bed, as well as putting to bed Bonapartism, is a sign of something deeply progressive in terms of what they can produce. But perhaps it's also deleterious. Matilda.
Uh, um, I feel like without knowing a lot about all of the Althusserianisms and the people who spawned from him, it does seem dangerous in the sense like I feel a bit unmoored by like reading this, but I feel like it's pretty decisive and useful. I think within For Marx as a book, like he did well to like contrast or at least to like oppose the Hegelian dialectic and show its weaknesses, but he hadn't really developed or articulated the Marxist dialectic as much. And it's a bit surprising like what comes out. In particular, I was surprised about condensation and displacement, or like metonymy as like yeah, so it was like displacement and then condensation and then like a global rupture were kind of like three moments for his dialectic. And I feel like they stood in, he was saying like the Hegelian and Engelsian approximations were like the the change from quantity into quality, like that sort of dialectical movement. And he seems to like elaborate on it further and point in very interesting directions. I think what is maybe the most dangerous about it is that you can't say what the outcome of an analysis before you do it. So you can't say that like you're gonna find like at the end of the day like some economic essence of history. That like well, like at the end of the overdetermination essay, he says in the appendix that like he critiques Engels and says like you can't basically say what the content is until you like go and investigate, or like what the primary contradiction is even, and like the higher, like he also says that like it's economism. He goes even further and says like it's economism to create like a hierarchy of spheres of influence in a historical conjuncture prior to an analysis to like articulate some hierarchy of the spheres, or like to like give like weights to each ideological sphere in their hierarchy of dominance. To do that even before analysis, he says is like economism, or he says it's mechanism. And so he kind of like wagers even further that you can't say what the content of the historical analysis will be. So in a sense, I could see how perhaps you could get to the point where you're not focused on economics.
Uh-oh. God forbid. Damn.
Yeah.
Matilda, I love how you just like gleaned like 20 points that we didn't even, because this was a lot of pages to read. You hit a lot of excellent points there that we neglected to mention. Sorry to interrupt you though. You had a final or a few other things to say?
I maybe I'll chime in later. I think I said everything.
Thank you for that intervention, Matilda. That was huge. Yeah. I'm still thinking about Conrad's notion that the essay is a failure. I mean, I'm not sure if I want to see it that way, because when we see it in the sort of grand composition of all of his work, I mean, there is a lot of secondary literature that shows that Deleuze's conception, this is total side point, Deleuze's conception of Hegel, this Montesquieu idea of Hegel as like bourgeois individual interiorism, where no contradiction can happen and everything is subsumed in itself, and like none of the concepts like work to produce change or something like that, which you find in difference and repetition. I forget the author. I think it's Montag, the Althusserian author.
Warren Montag, yeah.
Yeah. He says Deleuze got this like, exactly from being in Althusser's seminars at this time, and that Althusser is an incredible reader of Hegel at the end of the day. Like, actually, he's way more of a Hegel specialist than people give him credit for. Like, stretching back, I think Conrad knows, like, what was he was like, as a young scholar, he just published a lot on Hegel, right?
That was his main thing.
It's the main thing, yeah. So, which is kind of tragic, though, because, like, you know, I really feel expunged from what Hegel is capable of doing after I read Althusser. I mean, like, he's just so thoroughly dismissive. It sucks. Aaron.
Oh, I was just going to say something kind of brief about the question you asked about the kind of deleteriousness of Althusser, which honestly I have a kind of mixed mind about, because I take very seriously the kind of accusations of theoreticism and that kind of thing, and I also think that there was something pervasive in the kind of the context that he's writing in, the context that would immediately follow. You know, Deleuze and Guattari have this very famous saying about the philosopher as kind of the creator of concepts, and people tend to kind of invoke this dismissively and all this. So I think this kind of thing about like creating new concepts, creating new problematics. This is obviously key to like Foucault and stuff too. So I think it's kind of the moment, in some ways. But I think on the other hand, like contra the theoreticism, I think that for me, what's been really fresh about reading Althusser and having all these essays collected into the volume is that I think that the kernel of what he's trying to do throughout all of these essays, the kind of emphasis on scientificity and the kind of emphasis on looking at what he says repeatedly have been kind of explicated practically and trying to give them a kind of theoretical rigor for the past, present, and future. I find that that's in some ways very fresh because we live in a moment on the left that is just so chock full of kind of logical fallacies and appeals to authority, where it's about kind of like picking quotes from Marx and picking quotes from Engels and picking quotes from Lenin and whoever, and the kind of mere invocation of these things is kind of tantamount to an argument. And Althusser is so clearly not satisfied with doing that. The epistemological break, I mean, he's rejecting half of Marx's canon in doing that. And so it's kind of he's able to invoke these things, even when the people that he has immense respect for and that he knows are kind of historically essential figures like Mao and Lenin and all these people. But he wants to be able to take the things that they did practically and give them or stress test them in some ways to give them a kind of applicability for the future. And so in a weird way, despite the fact that it's so theoreticist and despite the fact that it's so dense, it feels so fresh in that way because it's just not stale in the way that is kind of frustrating to be on the left now, where the kind of rigor of argumentation is really shallow in some sense. Obviously, the kind of theoreticism still permeates the left in many ways, and there's all sorts of like shit going on there. But I just think that I like the fact that he's able to take these people that we obviously have immense respect for, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao, and he's willing not to just appeal to them on the basis of their own kind of stature or their own kind of, and he wants to really stress test them and make sure that they're actually up to the task in some ways, theoretically. I don't know if that makes sense, but that, like, now that we're nearing the end of this, that's kind of one thing that's not a specific or minute point, but it's just kind of the macro level. It's
Right.
something that I've really enjoyed about the text.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. He takes like it's like this is like important to be and to be clear, like in Althusser's time, like the environment was every bit as much defined by this kind of dry appeal to quotes as sources of authority, even more so, arguably, right? Because of the existence of real top-down political structures. Whereas now we find that intellectual discourse is similarly subordinated, but like it's kind of internally subordinated by scholars, which is a different position to be in, of course. But sort of the Trotskyist hierarchy in English, of course, right? But no, I mean, I think that but what also was happening in Althusser's time was there was a tremendous momentum, right, with respect to actual political changes that were taking place. So even if he doesn't finesse this relationship, in a way, the very possibility of something like Althusserianism, is itself a testimony to the capacity of, theory, if you will, to mediate and to reflect upon processes of practice, which are fresh and vital, right? So he's drawing from kind of the wellspring of everything that's going on, and producing something new. But I do think it's also very important to acknowledge, like, there's a certain indolence within like the current way Marx is thinking, whatever advantages we might have in a purely intellectual level compared to that time, whatever the advances in scholarship. And I would argue that there's been a lot of advances in scholarship, if not so much the production of new concepts by virtue of the hollowing out of practice itself. But anyway, he says very clearly, like, my goal is to construct a Marxist philosophy. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that Marxism has not been strong as like philosophy qua philosophy, right? And part of the very intelligence of Althusser's inquiry is that his construction of a philosophy involves paradoxically a valorization of the non-philosophical elements, or the approaching of the non-philosophical elements within a philosophical frame, right? And this is why, in a way, Althusser is like, the bane of everybody, right? Because like, he's too Marxist for the real philosophers, but he's too philosophical for the real Marxists, right? But what I will say is that, again, whatever advances have been made in scholarship, this project is never completed. Insofar as it's completed at all, it never really has political purchase. But in general, I mean, it's like Marxism is very weak philosophically. That's reality. Now, again, we could say that that's a necessary component of historical materialism, which is more scientific than philosophy, right? But the point is that no one has produced something like an intellectual or philosophical explication of that is fully satisfying. I think Althusser comes the closest to accomplishing that, right? And of course, there are some major Marxist philosophers. Of course, it's more remarkable in the field of philosophy than anarchism or something like that, right? But if we compare it to other species of philosophy as philosophy, right, there is a decisive weakness. And then the question becomes, how do we address that, right? And I think Althusser is on the right path when he tries to proceed from the side of an appreciation of it, a philosophical appreciation of it that acknowledges what isn't philosophical and what might be the advantage of that as well.
Fabulous. Connor, please jump in.
Yeah, what's up, everybody? When Conrad was talking, I was reminded of I think it's the essay for next week, actually, when you're talking about Marxism as a weak philosophy. I think in the next essay he talks about Marxism is not a philosophy, right? Very famously. So he might agree with you there. Or what does he mean by that? Is something we're gonna find out. But yeah, also when Aaron was speaking, I was just thinking that the demands that Althusser is placing on us are enormous, right? And they're nothing other than, Marxism has to be as dynamic as the respective political situation that we find ourselves in, right? Which is not easy to do, right? But it's a call to be more dynamic, right? But also just going back to what Conrad was saying, the provocation that this is a failed essay, like, what does that mean if that is true, right? So like, what is Althusser really trying to do with this essay? Might be another way to register that. So, for one, I think he's like registering just a crisis in the production of theory, right? Whether that's because of Stalinism, which certainly seems to be going on in the background of this essay, or I think with this sort of like Marxist reevaluation of how to incorporate a theory of imperialism into Marxism or orthodox Marxism. And imperialism is also, especially for Lenin, has to do with monopoly, right? So I think then sort of emphasizing these things might suss out why it is there is this emphasis on the last instance being the economy. And I'm just reading that as sort of like a strident affirmation of, the foundations of political economy for Marx, right? In other words, like we can't confuse ourselves with valorizing the immediately political situation, whether it's for imperialism or in combating monopoly, right? Something like this, maybe. So, and then alongside this, there's also the constant threat of like positivism. And so, like combining all of these things, there's a sort of increasing immediacy and localization of how it is that we think of the political, maybe. And all of this is stultifying to abstract thought. So I think these are sorts of like the things on the agenda for Althusser that we have to constantly, fight against. So I think then that also explains like why this emphasis on the situation, right, that we find ourselves in. Because it's the respective moment that we find ourselves in that is something we have to deal with. I feel like I'm starting to ramble a little bit now, but I think you get the general point. But other than that, I also wanted to ask a question on getting on the generalities a little bit. Like, is what he's sketching out here like an attempt or a claim that this is what Marx is doing? Like, is that the idea that's being put forward here? Or is he making a more, I don't know, like nuanced move? Because when I looked at the generalities, I was reminded of Michael Heinrich's Reader's Guide to Capital Volume 1, if anyone's ever read that. And it looks quite similar to Marx's method according to Heinrich to me. So yeah, I don't know, just some things, but
It's extrapolated. It's extrapolated. Parts of it are extrapolated from the 1857 introduction. Um, and indeed, one could argue that in a certain sense, the problem with this essay has to do with the way that like Althusser introduces a certain form of scholarship, if you will, that's going to chafe against innovations that he's produced elsewhere. Um, but Marx's comments are basically notebooks. And he doesn't say like, well, this is something that happens entirely in thought. I don't think, or anything like that. So Althusser kind of, makes more schematic and, clarifies, if you will, in the way one clarifies, right? Always at the risk of losing some of those comments. But yeah, I wanna say about the description, the talk of Marxist philosophy. There's a note at the beginning of this essay where he says, I use the word theory in this to describe it. Like today, I use the term Marxist philosophy. And I think this English version was published in '67. So this presumably is reflecting like the shift when he talks about philosophy as class struggle, right? So when I talked about, the seriousness with which he takes the creation of a Marxist philosophy, I'm anchoring that would be more germane to talking about like his post 66 or 67 output in that way. But what was can you just repeat again? I just got your second point that you made after you were saying.
it was just about like, what does this mean if we fail? If this essay failed or something? Is that it? Or
Oh, you were talking about the locality of that. Yeah. So this is the issue with
yeah.
the locality issue. So, like in a way, he meditates upon the locality. He talks about Lenin being a conjunctural thinker, right? And he says it would be inappropriate to leap from that to like a kind of total generality, right? Um, Not his words, but this is essentially what he's saying. But at the same time, again, like this gets back to the problem of the philosophical character of this essay, right? Because he's not just saying, oh, like I'm just producing something for right now, right? If I understand properly, right? He's also, dealing with these like capital M methodological questions, right? Which produces a certain insensitivity to the content in question. So I don't think that all of the issues in the essay can be resolved away by saying like, well, it's just like, an immediate intervention or something like that, right? Like in many ways, if you look at something like contradiction over determination, like that would be a more possible explanation for that essay because it's an attempt to, again, scientize and kind of raise up actual events in the 20th century, right? But it's not an attempt to produce, as you will, an epistemology without a critique of epistemology, but to produce an epistemology of Marxism, which I think is really where this essay runs into difficulty. But to the extent that it functions in a more localized way, then I think we could, I think there are definitely good things. I think there's lots of things you can take from this. I think you can definitely, situate it in terms of the crises of the time intellectually, the desire to kind of cast Marxism as a science or turn it into a court of appeal that could be used to, reverse some of the abuses of Stalinism and so on and so forth. All very relevant. But I don't. The problem is that's not its only goal,
Yeah,
as stated.
just to maybe clarify really quickly, like I'm not like the point I'm trying to make is that like this immediacy and localization is a problem, right? It's like the thing
Yeah.
in front of us that we're dealing with, right? And thus we can't think abstractly and beyond the empirical and observable, right? Which is a
Mhm.
crisis of theory, right? We can't see
Mhm.
beyond that. So, it's not a good thing that we're caught up in the immediate then, right? So
Yeah.
obviously.
I feel like there's a interesting dialogue, especially given that we have invoked the Neokantian accusation, which of course Lukács, as the other great Marxist philosopher of the 20th century, is notoriously accused of. But I think we should note a profound difference in ambition regarding level 2 of the generality. Because when Althusser says that level 2 refers to the dialectic of the in itself and the for itself, I would argue that one of Lukács's most profound wagers is to democratize Hegel for the working class. So like the merger thesis becomes in Lukács, if that's like kind of what's at stake with level 2, right? Thought at a scale which ambition, like historical ambition of the working class to the party and intellectuals, couldn't properly bridge, as evidenced by Lukács's reflections in right before May 68 on the failure of history and class consciousness, that he was trying to out Hegel, like he was trying to really materially bring the dialectic into the working class movement. And this idea of reification, you know, Conrad's talking about real abstraction. Reification would then be something about a horizon of an epistemology that would be capable of seeing social reality, which would then permit the working class to absolutely retain Hegel, because Hegel still instructs us in the process of a radical overthrowing of the fetishism of bourgeois social reality, which Althusser says is kind of a dead dog, by the way, which is a reflection on the crisis of Marxism. He's writing at the time where Marxism is fundamentally in crisis. Everything isn't working. Even Lukács's ambitious project isn't working, right? But still, nonetheless, I'm drawn to it because, yeah, sure, if they're both Neokantians, at least I want the one that's more ambitious. But maybe that's my own, like, I don't know. Kolia, please.
Oh, could I just jump in there quick, just to
Sorry,
say
yeah,
very
please.
quickly, before we go on. Yeah, so like the thing is, like, if we're gonna take it to generality two, which in a sense is like the formal philosophical question, then Lukács way beyond Althusser, right? In terms of, you know, the way that he discusses the link between dialectics and class struggle, and all of these themes. And that tells us something about the respective roles of Lukács and Althusser within what we might term, you know, Marxist philosophy. Because I would say that, you know, in the most unambiguous sense, like Lukács is like the greatest Marxist philosopher, right? You know, of precisely Marxism as philosophy. But I think that, you know, when we take it to the train of theory, or what Althusser is referring to, which is precisely the philosophical, right? I use the adjective, meditation upon the non-philosophical status of Marxism, then I think Althusser is, you know, the best at that. So I think it really depends how you kind
Okay,
of
but what's the subject? Like, what's the subjectivity of generality two? Like, that's my question. Like,
but that's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying like it doesn't like it doesn't have one,
that's your
right?
thesis. Yeah,
It does. That's my thesis. My thesis, it doesn't. I mean, there are allusions to different things we can talk about, but it doesn't have one. Therefore, it's a philosophical formalism. Therefore,
Yeah,
Lukács is much more sophisticated because his
got
work
it.
clearly is building philosophy, as you say, like, you know, and relating it to categories of class struggle in an effective way,
That's
right? So.
amazing. Yeah, that's so cool. Kolia, please jump in.
Yeah, good stuff so far. So yeah, it's interesting you said he's writing this at a time of a crisis in Marxism. And I think if 1963 was a crisis in French Marxism, I wonder what we would call 2025 in the United States today. I think we're in a far worse position here. So at the beginning of the essay, Althusser kind of charts a course and says he thinks theory needs to catch up to practice. I still think that's true, actually. And I think that, you know, Daniel, you were speaking about the danger of dogmatism, and perhaps Althusser frees us from some of those pitfalls. I think we're quite caught in dogmatism today. I think a lot of what passes for Marxism today is still waiting for this pure crisis between the bourgeoisie and proletariat, where that final battle emerges. And everything we're doing until then is sort of this propagandistic agitational preparation for it. So we do need to be discriminating about, you know, we can't branch off into this post-Marxist discourse. We do need to be discriminated. We need, I think, the dictatorship of the proletariat, but we also need to rethink, I think, what that means. And I think this is where we get to what Connor was talking about having a theory of dynamism, which is what I love about Althusser so far. And also early in the essay, he says that, what we call Leninism will go by a different name later. And I think that, speculatively, and this is, just something an area of research, that I've been mining myself, and this might be provocative, but I think we do have a name for this now, and I think this is what Alan Shandro gives us in his book Lenin and the Logic of Hegemony. And I think what he uses a cumbersome theoretical term, which is the politico-strategic logic of the struggle for hegemony. That's what he calls Leninism. And what that means is it preserves this irreconcilable antagonism, which is at the core of Marxism, between bourgeoisie and proletariat. It preserves the dictatorship of the proletariat, and it adds the theory or the art of war to this. And part of the dynamism of warfare is recognizing stages. And I think this is what I really latched onto with this essay by Althusser. He speaks of overdetermined specific situations, the stages, phases, and periods, and the mutations of specific domination that characterize each stage. He also says that, he speaks of the locus of confrontation, which I really like that language, in any conjuncture may vary. He speaks of, and this reminds me of something Daniel brought up in a previous session, that, the anti-imperialists think that what we might think of as the main contradiction that Marxism posits is actually not a contradiction in the imperial core. So he's sensitive to the fact of non-antagonistic versus antagonistic. He's getting some of this from Mao. These points of fusion that he talks about and the condensation of contradictions. I could go on, but I think, this sort of language of stages is actually directly from Lenin himself as the political writer, who in Letters from Afar speaks of the first stage of the first revolution in Russia in 1917, but certainly not the last. So Lenin himself is absolutely sensitive to the problem of stages. And I think this is very useful language in a context where I think Marxists today refuse stagism. Stagism is kind of a slur that Marxists often hurl at interlocutors, right? And so I think that's what I want to kind of bring into this conversation is the question of stages. Althusser uses the term fusion points. I think another thinker that I'm interested in is actually the former vice president of Bolivia, Alvaro Garcia Linera, who uses this term bifurcation points, which mark a decisive shift in hegemony, which is not, the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the conventional sense that we think of it as, but it marks a decisive defeat, a political defeat at a certain point in a conjuncture by the proletariat against the bourgeoisie that makes a gain, a decisive gain in hegemony for our side. And that is how the dictatorship of the proletariat is constructed in practice. And that's not going to be this pure crisis that many in the Marxist left are waiting for. Anyways, I'll leave it there for now.
That's really helpful. No, I mean, I think this notion of stages is compelling. I myself wasn't reading Althusser. I was reading him as arguing that the stages theory is tainted with a mechanistic conception of history and of the dialectic, and therefore rejecting it. Can you say a little bit more about how he is modifying the conception of stages? And I know that Conrad had recently read a lecture that Althusser gave on imperialism. Perhaps Conrad could mention some insights from that lecture, which I haven't read, because I do want to get a better grasp on this. And it's just a perfunctory thing, right? That people think that stages thinking is fundamentally vulgar. It must be rejected. And I'm sort of with you. I don't. So, but can you say more about it?
Yeah, actually, I skipped over one thing, which is someone brought up that Lenin's philosophy, or I think it was Conrad, yeah, that Lenin wasn't, a proper philosopher. He was more of a political writer. He was many things, right? And Stathis Kouvelakis has an essay that's interesting about this, which is, in there he says that after his revelations in the philosophical notebooks about Hegel's logic, Lenin goes on to do philosophy in the realm of practice, and he says that he has two philosophical theses, and he calls these dialectical reversals, which are the changing of the imperialist war into a civil war and the changing of the bourgeois revolution into a proletarian revolution. And so these are, Lenin's dialectical revelations in political practice. And this actually, I think, is pretty friendly to Althusser's thesis in this essay, that the method is there, even if it hasn't been properly theorized. And I think that dialectical reversal, we should think of as stages. I mean, what else are we talking about when we talk about a fundamental shift in the conjuncture? We can call that a dialectical reversal, but isn't that also just a stage? A qualitatively new stage, right?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that there's a lot of overreach and abuse regarding either a kind of overextension regarding theories of finance capitalism, monopoly capitalism, neo-feudalism, or neo-capitalism, etc., which Althusser never entertained any of that kind of what he would probably consider reformist type thinking. But I think still nonetheless there is like a complex commitment to something like the integrity of a stagist conception of capitalism as a world system. But Conrad, could you say something about his views regarding imperialism? Would that be okay?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I don't know what, I read through the book, is it History and Imperialism or whatever it is? I read through the book on imperialism, I forget the title, but I didn't find it very impressive. It's a lot of kind of like fragmentary run on notes and recorded stuff. He does touch on his appreciation of Lenin's imperialist hypothesis. But I don't think and by the way, I think, you know, there's the thing about Althusser is, it would be way too easy to say, oh, to look at the silences on the subject of imperialism, that we see in a lot of his work, and to conclude on that basis that he has nothing to say about the subject. Right? And I think people have commented at times like he wasn't, terribly active in terms of making statements about the war in Algeria or things of this nature. But I could be wrong, but I believe that's something that's been alleged. But, I think to think this way would be to ignore the fact that, his most well-known, arguably, contribution to Marxist thought in Contradiction over Determination is so connected to anti-imperialism, right? Because it's so connected precisely to, again, the overriding of this teleological conception of Marxism, according to which, revolution is going to happen in the most developed parts of the world, right? So to a significant degree, you can read his work insofar as it functions, and I think, his work functions more under the sign of Lenin and Mao than under the sign of a kind of originary Marxism, if you will, though of course that's always there. His work in large part turns out to be an attempt to extrapolate the implications of that, right? And I think that, the potential for, a more obviously political, if you will, rendition of this would be apparent in someone like Lasorda, right? So we've talked about a little bit, we've touched on the fact that Lasorda was an Althusserian when he was young, right? We talked a little bit about the importance, I think, somehow of the notion of the overdetermined contradiction for class struggle in particular. right? But it colors the way, and Lasorda will say like, well, that's already in Lenin and Mao. But the fact of the matter is, it would seem that he got it through Althusser, right, originally, right? So Althusser, at the very least, we could acknowledge he's a useful transmission mechanism. That would be the least credit we could give him in that equation. But, the possibility for a fuller expression of that, or a more political expression of that in any case, would be apparent in someone like Lasordo, because he so actively applies the notion of the overdetermined contradiction to all the different areas, right, of political struggle, right, in a way that's not, just caught within this sort of narrow prism of bourgeoisie versus proletariat that acknowledges it, right? But, we find within his work all of these discussions of, the peasant class in China, in his book on liberalism, there's like a lot of, significantly devoted to the topic of slavery, and its role in the economic evolution of the United States. So, again, I think it would be incredibly over hasty and dismissive to say that Althusser is not deeply involved with the question of imperialism. And I think, in fact, probably he's one of the most important Marxist thinkers for the topic of imperialism, even if the topic is not always addressed politically or directly as such within his work. But I wanted to say one other thing in response to, sorry, what was it?
Colia?
Yeah, in response to Colia. So Colia, could you just tell me again what was it? Can you just give me like what was your point again? Because I had something there, but you were saying,
I was talking about stages.
oh, stages. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. You got it. Yeah, stages is what I want. I have to keep all these things in my head, it's like, but stages. So I think the best. So like again, we have to differentiate here between like, categories, right, that are acknowledged within the kind of, Althusser, of course, didn't like this adjective, but within the kind of like, structuralist or quasi-structuralist framework he employs, and within stages in some evolutionist sense. So, Althusser would reject, of course, like this sort of teleological evolutionism, but nevertheless, he is compelled to acknowledge, of course, the authority of a certain kind of phasical or stage-based thinking, insofar as that's a component of Marxism, right? In spite of disavowing, a teleological, quote, Hegelian conception. And we do find him producing periodizations of this sort of his own from time to time. Of course, I found it very interesting, and Matilda drew attention to this. I thought it was quite fascinating, the idea of the three distinct moments of contradiction, right? From non-antagonism to antagonism to explosion, which, if I understand properly, is sort of the shift from because there's always class conflict, right? But it's the shift from like the non-appearance of class conflict to the appearance of class conflict, right? Which thereby, of course, affects it materially, to the explosion or qualitative transformation of society. And that actually gets back to your point. You said, what would we describe America in 2025, right? And one way you might describe it is within the language of non-antagonism, right? In other words, that, there's this, profound and increasingly empty attempt, right, to paint the periodizations, or to paint the movement of American society, in terms of some kind of quantitative liberal capitalist trajectory, and to subsume all the developments that occur within that. But that's increasingly inadequate to what we see, right, which is the appearance of class struggle, and that has material indices as well, obviously. But in terms of this question of stages, for me, like the best, and I talk about this in Flowers for Marx, the forthcoming book that Tut did the forward for. But for me, the best treatment of this is in The Political Unconscious by Jameson. And I think Jameson is one of the maybe the greatest Althusserian, if you will. It depends what you call an Althusserian, of course. But he's certainly much closer to Althusser's methodology than like Badiou or something.
That's
Right?
amazing that you say that.
That what, the Jameson's an Althusserian?
Yeah, because he's like, Mr. Sartre, or he was Mr. But I mean, I see what you mean. He reads everything, and I think you could make an argument. Although he once wrote a review essay of Alain Badiou, which was like really wrong and off and not good, and it was published because he's Jameson. He could publish whatever he wants, so it was published in
Yeah.
the Left Review. But it was like, that's not what Badiou says about ontology, my friend. Sorry,
Yeah.
but he's Jameson. So anyway,
Yeah, well,
so
that's no, but again, but by the way, and about this, like this is even characteristic of what we're talking about with like the dogmas of how Marxism functions today, because to a significant degree, again, well, I said that, you know, like this governance of intellectual discourse by intellectuals is not the same as like the governance of intellectual discourse by the PCF. To a significant degree, what we have is like, a kind of cartel of personalities, right? And Jameson, of course, was a great scholar, like in general, right? But all I mean is it's like, I mean, NLR or something kind of epitomizes this, right? Where, access is a question of connection,
yeah,
right? And then there are certain journals that sort of purport to be making a more impartial assessment. But like, the thing is, it's a small economy, and it's ultimately a little bit dubious as to whether impartial assessment really exists in this context, or whether it's sort of tribute to established personalities. But anyway, that's a bit of a digression. But to me, the the best treatment of this is in Jameson and the Political Unconscious. And what he actually says about this is he says like, because he's like Jameson's in that book, Jameson's trying to respond to postmodern critiques, right? Which, of course, Althusser isn't doing in the same way in this text because that didn't exist in the same way. But the idea that Marxism is like a grand narrative, for example, right? Which is that's oh, is that it's not
Lyotard.
that's Lyotard. Yeah, I was saying, yeah, I was trying to get my name. Yeah, yeah. But that's Lyotard. Yeah. So it's like if you look at Jameson's response, what he basically says is that the problem of accusing Marxism of being a grand narrative would be that it would be to act as if like narrative has no material context within reality, right? In other words, that stages, right, do not have a material context, right? So what Jameson sort of argues is like if you look at capitalism, even from like a completely secular standpoint, right? There are processes which are not just linear, right, or teleological, right? The capitalism as a mode of production will go through in its development, right? And what he points out is that this speaks to, in addition to instilling in us, I think, a necessary skepticism about anyone who would derive any kind of categorical thought, right? Because that's actually necessary for the circumscription of reality, right? That this actually tells us something about the way that narrative functions as
Oh,
well, right?
yeah.
Because the thing is like part of his point is that, you know, no, like in some way, shape, or form, we could talk more about fiction or we could talk about theory, but reality always has to be narrativized in order to be represented, right? Because you can't just give the exact thing. Like you can't give the entire empirical rendition of reality, if you will, right? So there's sort of a defense here, right? Of the idea that you're going to need these kind of, as you say, stages or kind of schemas in order to understand things, but also of the idea that, in a way, what we find in theory is a kind of secular presentation of something we can also see in fiction, right? Because fiction also provides us, right, with a sort of mapping of reality, right? And I think for Jameson, the highest works of fiction, right, would be works of fiction that are very informative with respect to how we understand social reality this way, right? So I've always found that to be like the most effective response on the question of stages, and I think it helps clarify certain things that are also latent within Althusser as well.
Yeah, it's really good. I mean, this whole last section on unevenness, and this idea of wrestling with this sort of focal point of a concentration of an overload of a primary contradiction onto a given political scene or given political situation. I mean, one of the ways that obviously gets taken up in Marxist discourse is to prescribe what subjectivity will be the guarantor of, like, even in a decisional sense, or sort of like a of the primary contradiction in some sense, which is, I think, goes back to a lot of Badiou's criticisms of Althusser, revolving around this idea that, well, you know, the Shanghai Commune points the way forward for any Marxism in the West, because what it showed was that the masses are capable of basically seizing history and running out ahead of the party. And so it's about this kind of careful placement, right? Between like the masses, which, of course, another thing we should note here is the whole conception of social revolt in the wake of Maoism is fundamentally reliant on a conception of the peasantry as a revolutionary class, which contained a profound level of social spontaneity, which was like seismically palpable and like capable of upsetting the social order, right? Yes, of course, the working class, but of course in China it was not the industrial working class, which was so dynamic. So there's also that kind of question about the failure of revolts and the post 68 question. Oh yeah, Akshay, welcome. How are you? Please jump in.
Yeah. No, I'm good. I'm good. I was just, I don't know, I was just kind of following along, and I was really sort of provoked by Kolya's question about sort of stages. I guess also because I also had this understanding of like Althusser sort of like repudiating stages, but then, you know, like it's, I'm sort of just thinking out loud, but it felt like what would a developmentalism without teleology kind of look like? And it seems to get to this question of also like, well, what is the conjuncture in relation to like the category of practice, right? Like if you had like on the one hand like a hard determinist kind of developmentalist position, right? Like then you kind of disallow any kind of vanguardist kind of Leninist adventurism, right? In that sense. And on the other hand, there's this sort of like the non-teleological aspect of this being like sort of open, like openness to this, like the opportunities created by the uneven development. But then it's sort of like from which position do you, and you know, like I guess like teleology makes me think of like developmentalism from the perspective of like totality. But I guess there's something much more concrete about like Althusser's sort of primary assumption, which is that, you know, like insofar as it's going to be a conjunctural analysis, it's always within a conjuncture that imposes itself as, you know, a conjuncture, and kind of like it's in that situation that you would have a certain, I don't know, developmental logic of like things happen one after another, and so these events led to a thing. But then, yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting because it does leave open that question of like from where is that unit of, you know, of the thing that's happening right here. I don't know. I mean, in a way, I feel like that's, it sort of leaves it open to this kind of like materiality of like what actually happened at that event, right? Like it's sort of can't be preempted. Anyway, I'm not sure if what I'm saying is making a lot of sense, but I found that like, yeah, developmentalism without teleology, I just thought was an interesting sort of notion that what Kolya said put into my head.
Yeah, 100%, because I feel like the wake of like de-Stalinization has forced Marxism to also abandon developmentalism, which of course Lacerda radically chastises Western Marxism for doing that. So there is that kind of Western Marxist utopianism that sees, but also says a tricky figure, right? Because while he possesses a profound elitism the École Normale and all of his students and everything like that. If you actually read the political biography of Althusser, he's like way more measured, and he tends to situate his political, like ethico-political stances with the Communist Party over the university, which kind of goes to Drew's point, which is that against Conrad's argument that Althusser produced as an academic. Actually, Drew says he did not produce as an academic.
Well, yeah, I mean that's not to say what I meant, but
No,
yeah,
but
no, I
no,
mean,
but it's important though, right? Because
yeah,
he didn't produce under the pressure of the rat race or whatever the fuck you want to call it. You know, it's not like, I'm not saying you were saying that, but I'm just saying, like, I think that's important
yeah,
because all
yeah.
of his stuff does have this pretty, yeah, I guess like political
It is
motivation.
inspired. It
But I
is
just want to say
inspired.
one other thing. Theory does do a lot of work, but I really like this idea of there is a certain humility, right, about the unknowingness, about the intellectual's capacity to discern the distinction between primary and secondary contradiction in a given conjuncture. And I felt that like that distinction that he makes between political contradiction and theoretical contradiction is interesting because he does want to give theoretical like a lot of weight, or you know, which would then presage him giving, as Garo says, too much power to theory, too much power to philosophy, overly politicizing it. So maybe the task is not to shy away from that, but to rethink the question of the subject, which we've kind of returned to a lot here, right? This missing question of the subject. And by the way, I mean, this is Badiou's theory of the subject, right? I don't know how people feel about that book, but if you sort of like remove the excessive Maoism from it, I think it is trying to make a very important intervention in post-Althusserian context, just as a side point.
I just wanted to add about this whole thing about like Stalinism and teleology. Like obviously there is this, you know, teleological impulse within Stalinism. It's such a weird teleology though. Because like if you think about it, like it's already constructed upon Leninist premises in some way, shape, or form. So in other words, like, you know, Stalinism would already be at the level of like a strategic employment of teleology, right? That enters the picture with the failure of world revolution, right? Because, you know, and again, like teleology is never, it's never out of the picture, right? And again, someone like Jameson would defend this in a way. But remember, like if we look at Trotsky, right? What is Trotsky's theory, right? Well, you know, a backward country isn't going to be able to develop socialism itself, right? Therefore, there has to be world revolution, which, you know, especially in his time really meant, above all, revolution in the West, right? So that's embedded within a certain teleological dimension, which would be very clear, like if you look at Platypus or something as like, you know, hyper teleological, like neo-Trotskyist, whatever, right? To the point of like favoring imperialism in some bizarre way. But it's like, you know,
Platypus doesn't care to do what Kolya mentioned, which is to invert the direction of bourgeois revolution into proletarian. Like there's like an Adornian pessimism that any revolution could be anything other than bourgeois.
no, well, yes, but also like, but they do, to be fair, like they do, their ideas, like all the proletarian revolutions have been pseudo-proletarian revolutions because of the failure of world revolution. So like there's this messianic, like we just like push the bourgeois thing and then this will arrive at some point, right? Like so it's kind of
Which frankly, one of the things that the miseducation of Marxism in the university has done to me, I only had to realize this by reading like political texts of Marx and Engels. Marx and Engels did put a lot of trust in bourgeois revolutions as emancipatory. Not all of the time, but certainly at certain intervals.
they
So
were
that's
also the only things that existed in that time, like prior to the Paris Commune, which Marx declared the first. So it's such a different,
true.
like
True.
it's
True.
such a different context. But I meant about this, like, so Stalinism, theology is never far because if you look at Trotsky, we have the teleology of, the need for world revolution and revolution, particularly in the West, to enable socialism. If you look at Stalin, right, we have like a more localized developmental teleology, right? So the idea that, while world revolutions failed, but we can build socialism if we progress through these stages and develop ourselves economically within the Soviet Union, right? Now, I don't know like which of those is, you know, um, actually more teleological. I would almost incline to believe that the Trotskyist one is more teleological. But of course, it depends a lot on the nuance of interpretation. But I just mean that, like, Stalinism is such a weird teleology in that sense. And even, and of course, it was subject to philosophical vulgarization. But, even there are people, and I'm trying to remember the name of the author, but Ben Burgess cites him in his essay for Flowers for Marx. But there was like some author, and I think he wrote a book, and maybe he was citing Cohen, G.A. Cohen, I'm not sure. But I think there was another author who wrote a book for Zero. But like part of what the argument was that it was that the collapse of the USSR confirms like Marxist teleology of the originary type. Because if the USSR were to have succeeded, that would demonstrate that you could actually, instigate revolution, from a backward country without the immediate intervention of world revolution. So again, this is just to say, I just want to draw attention to like the strangeness of the simple ascription of teleology to Stalinism, because I do think it's always because Stalin in a way was like, like that was the Russian Revolution was the big break, in a way with teleology, but there was a certain form of affirmation within Stalinism, right? Because there was this idea that, well, we can go ahead like as a separate geopolitical bloc, right, without being instantly validated, right, by all the grand powers of the world. So that's very interesting as well.
Wonderful. Well, this is another amazing session. I think we'll meet in 7 days, in 1 week, to discuss Marxism and humanism, which is much shorter, but it's certainly a wonderful way to end our time together, which will be our 6th meeting. So, we kind of like read a lot in a somewhat short period of time, but I got a lot out of this, and it's been helpful for my research. I hope it's been helpful for others' researches or writing or whatever it may be. Any final thoughts? Yes, Linera looks amazing. I had heard of this figure, Garcia Linera, but I'm excited to read more of his work. Undergraduate mentor was a big fan. Very cool. Oh, wow. Thank you for that. Okay, great. I'll share a few things in the Discord, and I think maybe we could like make a list of things that came up that need to be shared in the Discord. I can put the chat in the save it perhaps, if that's helpful. Connor, do you have a comment you want to make? No, you're good. All right. All right, everyone. Conrad, thank you for your insights, and everyone else. Thank you. Sasha, all the best.
Cool.
We'll see you soon, okay?
Right.
Thanks.